So my next speakers, I'm actually really pleased to introduce a person public involvement session. And this is with Angela Donaldson-Bruce and Audrey Birt. Angela works with Versus Arthritis as National Director in Scotland, and Audrey is a leadership and health coach. So I'm quite excited to be able to, and very pleased to present this particular presentation. They're going to talk to us about pain, people, and place. So I'll pass over to you both now.
Thank you. I'm trying to share my screen, so fingers crossed it all goes well. Could you let me know? I'm so pleased everyone's having bother, and it's not just me, so something's happened. Yeah.
First time. We are.
Hallelujah. Now they've got to move. That's the tricky next part.
I'm sure they will.
Great. Thanks for inviting us along to this session. I think it may be a bit different to what we've heard so far, but not unconnected, just from a very different perspective. And I think it's great, certainly, to hear all of the great work that's going on to support people who are living in chronic pain. A wee bit of background before I go on to introduce the report and hand over to Audrey. Versus Arthritis, if you haven't heard of us, we're 3 years old, built on 80 plus years of heritage of two very different charities, but we're focusing now on supporting research into arthritis, to providing support for people living with the condition, and also to amplify the voices of those with lived experience within the decision-making processes that affect them wherever they live. And I think the challenge for us with this report was, I think in Scotland, it was really difficult, I think, for the MSK voices, and certainly particularly around chronic pain, to be heard in that wider agenda in Scotland. And we wanted to try a different approach. The approach we planned really was to introduce not just the people and the pain, but look at it in the context of place and how that impacted on people's response to how they managed that pain. Of course, we plan to roll out in 6 locations, face-to-face, focus groups, asking people about their pain, and of course, due to roll out in the spring of 2020 when the whole world imploded and everything changed.
That's it.
That's it, moving now.
Yeah.
Okay. So what we did, we after we got over the shock of having to be locked down for a while and we started to get the team to work virtually, we thought we'd review how we plan to take this work forward. And this report isn't a policy report, but it is an attempt to illuminate the landscape of chronic pain in Scotland. And actually, we've used it ourselves already in how we use the insight on the work that we do, the support that we provide in Scotland. And also, we used it to influence what we asked for as part of our tackling, taking on the problems of chronic pain in Scotland as our Scotland Versus Arthritis manifesto in the election in 2021. So it's a record. Right, here we go again. Oh, yeah. So the purpose of it really was to design and deliver a record of that lived experience of people living with chronic pain in Scotland, to provide a summary based on one-to-one interviews of lived experience. And this is 23 individuals living with MSK-related pain in the NHS Grampian area, which is where we started. We covered a range of communities, rural and urban, different cohorts, young people, older people, people shielding, etc., during COVID-19. And we wanted to capture those voices that can be lost in other processes, as I've mentioned, and particularly to illuminate the MSK pain voice as part of the wider agenda. Obviously, the place element plays one aspect in this role. In this report, this one focuses on 23 people from Grampian, but we are looking at this being phase 1 of a wider programme, and the place element will become more and more important as we do the other aspects of that. We were really fortunate that Audrey Birt, who is a well-respected thought leader in everything health and social care in Scotland, agreed to work with us on carrying out the one-to-one interviews and to collate and write the report on our behalf. And she's well placed to give some insight into what people were saying about their experiences of pain, where they live, but also in the context of COVID. So I'm going to hand over to Audrey at this point. And Audrey, you're going to get to say next slide, please. And if you need to add anything, just shout. I can't see anything other than the slide at the moment.
Okay, thanks, Angela. And thanks for the flattering intro. I'm very passionate about helping people with lived experience to be able to shape policy and practice. So I was delighted to work on this with Angela and the team in Versus Arthritis. As Angela was saying, the approach was focused on Grampian because we really had to rethink how to do this in a way that kept the people we were engaging safe and the interviewers as well, of course. It was myself and a colleague called Hazel Mackenzie. We're both ex-nurses and both trained coaches, and I think both were helpful when we did the interviews. 23 people via Zoom, FaceTime or telephone, and everyone had the choice in what they wanted to do or that technology allowed. And we were fortunate in that we got a good range of age groups. And mostly it was through some contacts, but also we recruited through social media, which we weren't sure how successful it would be, but actually it was quite always good to know that. We were, of course, in the throes of a global pandemic, and which had a local impact, but also a very individual and personal impact. As I said, Hazel and I, the next slide, please, Angela. Perfect. Hazel and I had the communication skills to work with people, and the previous work I had done around this was on suicide prevention, which you can imagine is a very stressful and distressing area to work in. However, both of us felt that we really heard a lot of distress, worry and pain in its widest sense as we spoke to people. And many of them took this opportunity to really have a cathartic release about the impact that living with chronic pain, MSK pain in particular, and the pandemic, that double whammy had affected them. As Angela said, we analysed this as well in terms of pain, people in place. And of course, they're false divisions and, will affect the other. But it did help in order to pick out some themes. And interestingly, although we did the interviews quite separately, when we looked to share the themes were very similar and very powerful. One of the things that we did find was that medication was one of the key things that people asked for or spoke about. Sorry, I'm getting a bit of recall, a bit of noise in the background. I wonder if it's people needing to...
perhaps, Angela, if you could perhaps go on mute while Audrey's speaking and then vice versa.
Right, that would be helpful. Yeah, thanks. So people spoke about the medication that they were on, and you'll notice that we speak about the hope compromise, but there was still a lot of, and this will be familiar to all of you, I'm sure, a lot of investment in that silver bullet pain relief that will just take away people's pain and not trouble them anymore. And of course, although maybe for some people, they still had held on to that truth. For others, they knew it wasn't going to happen, but they still hoped. And that can get in the way of people moving on in any other sort of sense. What struck me as someone who's especially worked on self-management for a number of years now, that there was very little mention of self-management. And people generally spoke of not coping terribly well. When we asked about, where they were on a pain scale, there was often quite a difference in how they described themselves in that. So, maybe they would say, oh, I'm a 6 or a 7, but then described wakening every night, groaning in pain, wakening their spouse with yelling out in pain, which sounded a lot more than they were describing when they came to try and analyse it in terms of a pain scale. And it really struck me how poor that was, a way to analyse how people are really feeling. There was much talk of joint replacement surgery, and of course during the pandemic people could feel the timescales that they've been given just slipping away, or quite a number of people mentioning that they were told they were too young to have a joint replacement, which struck me so much that, I went and checked with versus arthritis, is this policy still? I thought that had changed, but whether it shouldn't be policy or not, it appears that it still is, and people are told they have to wait till a certain age, which seems completely wrong in a person-centred service, and something that I think we should be looking at, the practice versus the policy. There was something really powerful when people felt heard, that people really recognised, when people really recognised the amount of impact that chronic pain has. And if people felt understood, then it made a world of difference to them. But actually, what the current experience was, even if pre-pandemic hadn't been this, but during the pandemic, and I still consider ourselves to be in that place, that really there was a lot of a felt lack of understanding of how it felt to be in the situation they were in, particularly if they were told to be shielding. Not many of our cohort were, but the ones who were said it just had been singularly unhelpful. Mention of self-management, a lack of real knowledge about what self-management would be, and a real need for reassurance that was being able to on. These are the bits about pain. Just keep an eye on time. People, some sense then, and I know this is from other work beyond arthritic pain and musculoskeletal pain, but people really feeling abandoned by services. One young woman with rheumatoid arthritis had gone from having, until March, having weekly physio, and when we interviewed it was October, and she had seen no one since March, and could see her independence and her pain increasing, independence going, her mobility going, and pain increasing. The huge impact on her life. What we also recognise, and what people spoke of, is the importance of informal networks and support. Of course, they spoke of family, and if we've learned nothing in this pandemic, it's about family, isn't it, and the importance of that. But also many informal networks, whether it's just a conversation at the shops or the library or, wherever, but also about some of the more structured support, which again had been lost and often not replaced. Mental health, everyone said their mental health had been affected by the pandemic. And when we see other issues around mental health. Now that perhaps shouldn't surprise us, but maybe something to be aware of, especially in this work, because, we know the strong interconnection between people's well-being mentally and emotionally, socially and physically. And the loss of hugs that really spoke to my heart. I keep threatening to hug everyone I see in the future. You'll be glad this is online now. But people really expressed that lack of touch and the loss of hugs, the loss of love really had especially affected them. And finally, about place. Now, obviously, there was this rural and semi-rural impact, which I know in Grampian with other work that I do as well. There's a particular challenge with access to transport and travel for services, be they hospital or social care or community services, and the importance of that and people being able to access. One of the things that people spoke about a lot that helped was hydrotherapy, and access to that varies hugely. But in one small community, for example, they'd fundraised locally to set up a hydrotherapy pool that they paid for, which was £10 a session, which can make it unaffordable for some, but at least was an improvement for many people. Access to outdoor space, and there's endless research now about access to green space and the difference that makes to our well-being, but obviously also for people's mobility, the ability to walk. We speak constantly to people with MSK about keeping active, and then during the pandemic in particular, there was so few means to do that, and walking around a high-rise flat, as one woman described, is hardly the way to lift your spirits. And employment and working from home is a really interesting one. Actually met quite a few people who were quite angry that employers had previously said they couldn't work from home, could not be done, and then suddenly they had to. So they weren't willing to adapt, even though it's the law, the equality law, to adapt for the needs. But as soon as the organisational needs became that, they did. And for many, that not commuting was great. However, being isolated at home was a real downside of that and affected all the other things. So I'm going to hand back to Angela now, who'll talk about next steps. Speak to that briefly, if you can't unmute, Angela.
Yeah, I think she's struggling to unmute. Would you be able to continue for us?
Yeah, I'll just finish off quickly then. So we're working currently on phase 2 of the project. We will be a split focus. One is on a geographical place of interest, which is in Angus, who were keen to work with us on this because of other changes that were happening. And also a focus on working with the Gypsy traveller communities, who I'm sure many of you know is access to health services and healthcare is very poor, and we want to learn how to do that in the future. And just to re-emphasise, the level of emotion and unmet need was all that we met. And, I think it's important that we recognise that with all that we're doing, the importance of all the work that all of you are doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. Thank you, Audrey. That's really interesting, and Angela as well. And apologies for the technical difficulties. Unfortunately, it looks like Angela's stuck on mute now, ironically. So, Audrey, you're here to field questions. Jackie's going to try and get her off mute from our end.
That's great.
I don't seem to have that option either.
Yeah.
So there has been a couple of questions, and one of the questions is, Did you find any information related to distress reported due to the close proximity with family members and obviously due to the pandemic associated restrictions? And was there any reported increased tension due to the increased time at home? Family dynamics, really, I guess.
Yes. We didn't pick up any family dynamics, although I know that to have been an issue in many places. Maybe it was a particular age group of some of the people we were speaking to. I think the younger people in isolation was maybe the bigger thing, younger people with usually rheumatoid arthritis living alone and, I had been studying but were isolated. That's probably the biggest. There was certainly anecdotally a real issue with people who hadn't seen family for a long time. And usually that's because of distance. Either within the UK or, of course, within Europe or further afield. Definitely that was a huge source of distress. But if it was offset by other things, that wasn't as bad. But if it was compounded by others, obviously that was bigger issue. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And I can see that Angela's put the full link, the link to the full report in the chat as well. I do think it's really useful to have these insights for people living with pain. I think one of the things that we find as clinicians is that when we ask similar questions, we get very different answers. And I think that's because partly, on my own thoughts, so that's part because the therapeutic relationship is different. And sometimes it depends on who's asking the questions as to what type of answer you get. So I think you get a different level of insight when it's done this way. So I think it's really useful. One question that's come up is, it is very useful and it is really important work as well, but what do you think are the relevant insights to take to make any changes?
For me, I assume that often people want to please. So, and also if they said they weren't managing their pain well, they felt somehow guilty, and that there was an implied self-criticism in there, even if it wasn't coming from a clinician. It might be felt as a projection of some kind. So I think giving people time to truly answer the what matters to you question sorry, I've forgotten the doctor's name who was speaking about it, the GP's name who was speaking about it earlier. Really getting into what matters to people is not only going to give you a clue as to how they're really doing, but also help you get an understanding of what their motivation will be to to go forward. And what I found very useful actually was to use my coaching skills, because although it wasn't a therapeutic interaction, that sometimes knowing the right question to ask really made a difference.
Angela, you're back on as well now, so we can hear you.
I am indeed.
You want to chip in?
Yes.
A couple of questions that are quite linked, actually. So David Walsh is asking, do you feel that de-prescribing and removing hope of that magic bullet or medication magic bullet is either realistic or desirable? Or should we continue to accept that people choose to try both managing the pain and trying to stop it?
I'm happy to jump in, and Audrey, you can fill in at the back of me if I miss out. I think it was interesting, David, when I was listening to your presentation, because it very much chimed what you were saying around that kind of need for a magic bullet, and actually people still expecting it. It really chimed very much for me about how people feel about it and what actually came out of these conversations. I think the reality is there isn't a magic bullet. I think the nearest we've got, certainly for osteoarthritis, is the joint replacement. As you said, that's one of the most successful treatments we've got, but that's for osteoarthritis. It doesn't work more widely for other conditions. And I think we need to own that. We need to be honest about it, that there isn't a magic bullet. And us pretending that clinicians have all the answers is really just, it's not sensible and it's not the way forward. In terms of, is there one it's not black and white. People need help. People need help to manage their pain, and they need help to manage their pain well. And part of that is, again, about what Karen was saying about the conversation. It is about having a relationship with your health professionals and developing a trusted relationship where you can have those conversations saying, I've done all I can do for you. I need you to do something here too. We're in this together, and have a conversation about it. So for me, it's a mix of both, and actually keeping the conversation going and working towards improvement all the way too. Audrey, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think it is a really good question, David. And I think there are also people who want to come off pain killers, because we met a few of those who really weren't taking anything because they wanted to stay away from. I think it's all about framing, which I think you touched about on in your own presentation. It's not about saying, we can't do any more for you. Pain relief isn't the only answer. And for people, and I'm one of them who lives with chronic pain, when you also live with the side effects of pain relief, that you'd rather find the answer without the kind of side effects that you would get. So it's about how we present things together, not an and or, a yes or no, but as a mixture of resources to help with pain. And it's a relational treatment, isn't it? And the more that the clinician has a good relationship, whoever they are, OT, nurse, doctor, physio, if they have a good and trusted relationship, that's where therapeutic benefit comes, I think.
Thank you. And I think that probably answers the next question on an individual level, which was around how we can address the tension that's caused between deprescribing and patients with a lived experience, or people with a lived experience of pain wanting medication, and how do we work as health professionals with patients with pain, so we can try to get a shared aim. And I think that your insights there really work well on an individual level. I think it probably becomes a bit harder when you're trying to do a broad brush, a scope on a national level, because then you lose that individuality. But thank you very much. What do you think about that, Angela?
I think that's where the third sector has a real important role to play, around making sure people get all of the information they need at the right time, in the right place, that supports them where they are. I think that the work we do around self-management support and pain management techniques across the third sector, really, in a variety of ways, when people understand how pain impacts them and on their body, and understand what they can do to help, whether it be meditation, even breathing properly, just basic common sense things that people don't teach you until you're actually dealing with the problem at the time. Just learning to breathe properly helps you relax and manage your pain better. So we have a role in kind of upskilling the population to fully understand that there isn't a magic bullet, that there are things that you can and need to do for yourself, but actually it isn't an either or. It's possibly for the individual to decide what do they want to achieve in their life with living with chronic pain. For me, again, like Audrey, I'm someone who lives with it. I need to function effectively because my work's important to me. So everything I do is around me being able to function effectively and manage my pain at the same time. And those are individual conversations, and they're not necessarily easy conversations. And I have often told health professionals, I'm not having it. And that's a different conversation to the one you have from the person who's saying, go and give me, I need it. But it's being aware that it's the need for an individual response to the individual you've got in front of you.
Thank you, Angela. So I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to wrap up there, but I'd like to take the opportunity to say thank you to Harry, Carol, Audrey and Angela for really good talks. Very different talks, but also very interlinked because they're all aiming towards the same goal, I think. So this is the end of this session. Moving on to lunch and networking. So the site will still be open to be allowed some networking, and the next session will start at 2 o'clock. And thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Thanks.